Every day it's this delay. How much longer will I have to wait today?
Everyone at Mason's Diner knew two things about Jack Thompson. He was the rudest customer they'd ever seen, and he left the most generous tips in town. No one could understand why. Before we see what happens next, let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The constant sound. Of November, rain beat against the fogged windows of Mason's Diner, like impatient fingers drumming on a table. The familiar smell of grilled bacon and fresh coffee hung in the heated air, mixing with the sweet aroma of maple syrup that permeated every corner of that small family restaurant. But that Tuesday morning, the welcoming atmosphere was charged with an almost palpable tension. "Marcus, table 12, said Mason, and the young man sighed heavily. "Again? Wasn't it my turn yesterday?" Jenny, organizing napkins at the counter, laughed softly. "No one else wants to serve him. I always pretend I'm busy when he arrives." "At least he pays well," Carlos murmured. "Always generous tips. Strange. For someone so rude," Marcus completed. "Yeah, I never understood that contradiction." Jack Thompson, 72 years old, occupied his usual table, number 12, against the back wall, from where he could observe all the restaurant's movement. His steel-grey eyes, marked by deep lines that only decades of military command could sculpt, shot daggers at Marcus, who approached with reluctant steps. Marcus took a deep breath, mentally counting to 10 as he had learned in his 4 months. At Mason's. He knew the veteran's quirks, his chronic impatience, the way his words always came out a tone higher than necessary. But there was something different that morning. Maybe it was the accumulation of poorly slept nights working double shifts, or maybe it was simply the limit of human patience being reached. "Mr. Thompson," Marcus said, approaching the table, "your meatloaf is being finished in the kitchen right now. Meanwhile, would you like some coffee?" "I don't want lukewarm coffee," Jack responded brusquely. "You make coffee and keep it in those thermal carafes for hours." "Sir, the coffee was made just a little while ago," Marcus explained, keeping his voice controlled, "and your lunch will be ready in 5 minutes. Jack slammed his hand on the table with unnecessary force, the sound echoing through the dining room and making some nearby customers startle. "5 minutes, that's too long. In the medical field, every second counts. You should know that." Marcus felt the heat rise up his neck. For 4 months, he had swallowed comments like that, accepting the rudeness as part of the job. But that day, something snapped. "Sir," the word came out harder than Marcus intended. "With all due respect, we're not in a war zone. That's the past. We're in a restaurant, and I'm doing my job the best way possible." "Boy, what did you say?" asked Jack. Marcus wasn't sure if the elderly man didn't understand what he had said, or if Jack wanted a confrontation. It was then that Marcus repeated firmly, word for word, this time a little louder. The silence that followed was like a bomb. That explodes without making noise, devastating in its completeness. Jack fixed his eyes on the young man, and for a moment, Marcus saw something that made him almost regret his words. It wasn't anger that shone in those tired eyes, but a pain so old and deep that it seemed to have become part of the man's bone structure. "Oh, you have no idea what you're talking about," Jack murmured, but his words seemed to echo louder in the tense silence. Marcus untied his apron with brusque movements, his hands trembling slightly. "You know what? You're right. I have no idea. And you know why? Because you've never treated me like a human being. You always talk loud, yelling at people. It seems like you're deaf. From the beginning, I was pushed by others to serve you. No other employee can stand hearing your voice anymore, your criticisms about every detail, or being your personal punching bag." He threw the apron onto the table. "But I'm tired of being treated like trash." The restaurant had become a museum of silence. Even the sound of the fryer in the kitchen seemed to have ceased. Jack remained motionless, staring fixedly at his hands while turning the ring on his finger. From the counter, Jenny and Carlos watched the scene with a mixture of shock and fascination. Finally, someone had confronted the feared customer from table 12. "I work 2 jobs to support my little daughter," Marcus continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I sleep 4 hours a night studying accounting because I want to give her a better life, and you treat all of this as if it were insignificant." Marcus walked toward the counter where Mr. Mason, the owner, observed the scene with an expression of worry and sadness mixed together. "Mr. Mason, I quit. Send my last paycheck by mail." The glass door closed behind Marcus with a dull sound, making the little entrance bell swing melancholically. Jack continued sitting, motionless, like a stone statue amid the palpable discomfort that had settled in the environment. Jenny and Carlos exchanged significant looks. It was the first time they had seen anyone confront Jack Thompson in that way. Mr. Mason approached slowly, pulling a chair. George Mason had known Jack Thompson for 8 years, since the day the veteran had appeared for the first time, shortly after moving to Virginia Beach. There was something about the man that had always intrigued him. Behind all that rudeness was a sadness so deep he could almost touch it, and there were the tips, always generous, always left in silence, as if they were a mute request for apologies. "Jack," he said with controlled firmness, "maybe it's time we talked." Jack didn't raise his eyes. "There's nothing to talk about. The boy couldn't handle the pressure." "Jack, you're aging. You're a widower. You can't push people away like this. I think you need to review some things in your life." Mason paused, choosing his words carefully. "I know we're not close, not friends, but you have to be careful with the people around you, at least in here. I respect you, Jack, but I need this kind of thing not to happen here anymore." "Discipline saved lives," Jack responded automatically, but his voice sounded hollow. "But here we're not saving lives, Jack. We're just trying to serve a good meal and maybe offer a little human warmth in a world that's already cold enough." It was then that Jack raised his eyes. Mason saw in them a glimpse of something that rarely appeared: confusion, maybe even regret. "I know you lost important people. I know you carry scars that most of us can't even imagine, but Jack..." Mason leaned forward. "Hurting people who are trying to help doesn't bring anyone back." Jack closed his eyes for a moment. Mason's words echoed something that Jessica, his daughter, used to say: "Daddy, your pain doesn't justify hurting others." But Jessica had been dead for 2 years, and with her had died the last person who could penetrate his defenses. Marcus was right to leave, Jack said finally, his voice lower. "I'm a difficult old man." "Yes," Mason responded with an honesty that few would have the courage to speak. "You're a retired veteran. You have your ghosts." He paused, already turning toward the kitchen. "I don't want to prolong this conversation. Just think about it. Jack," he picked up the towel from the counter and dried his hands, "and find something to occupy your mind. A hobby. It'll do you good." Jack remained silent for a long moment, the sound of rain filling the space between them. Finally, he stood up, leaving enough money to cover the bill and a generous tip. As he always did, in a silent attempt to compensate for something he couldn't express in words. "I'll take a break," he said. "Maybe it's better for everyone." But Mason knew Jack would return. Mason's diner wasn't just where he ate. It was the only place where he still felt minimally connected to the world. 3 days later, the help wanted waiter/waitress sign swayed gently in the morning breeze, attached to Mason's window with adhesive tape that was already starting to peel at the edges. Emily Carter stopped in front of the establishment, nervously adjusting the strap of her university backpack on her shoulder. At 18 years old, she had that contagious energy, typical of someone who still believes they can make a difference in the world, although at that moment she felt a pang of anxiety in her stomach. Her brown hair was tied in a practical ponytail, revealing a face that radiated determination masked by understandable nervousness. Emily came from a structured family: engineer father, elementary school teacher mother. But there was something in her that made her want to earn her own way, even when that meant leaving her comfort zone. The doorbell rang cheerfully when she entered, and she was immediately enveloped by the familiar smells that made Mason's Diner more than just a restaurant. There was a homey quality to the environment that calmed her slightly. The red vinyl chairs with small, careful patches, the white formica counter that shone from being so clean, the old photographs of Virginia Beach creating a nostalgic gallery. "On the walls. Can I help you?" asked Mr. Mason, emerging from the kitchen with a dish towel in his hands and a tired, mechanical smile. "I saw the sign in the window," Emily responded, her voice carrying a poorly disguised nervousness. "I'm looking for part-time work. I'm a college student studying psychology. Mason studied the young woman for a moment. There was something in her posture, shoulders slightly tense but direct gaze, that made him realize she was genuinely interested, not just desperate for any job. Previous restaurant experience? 2. Summers at a beach snack bar when I was in high school, Emily responded, hesitating only a moment. It wasn't anything very sophisticated, but I learned the basics. Mason nodded. Simple honesty was refreshing after the interviews of the past few days. Why do you want to work here specifically? Emily looked around, searching for some answer. I need the work to help with college expenses, and you're hiring. Mason smiled, the first genuine smile in days. It was the first real answer without beating around the bush that he had received since putting up the hiring sign. There's one particular customer you should know about. Jack Thompson, military veteran, has lunch here almost every day at table 12. He can be challenging. Emily swallowed hard. Challenging how? Demanding, impatient, sometimes rude. My last employee quit because of him. Emily bit her lip, clearly weighing the situation. I think I'll have to train my patience. The answer wasn't sophisticated, but Mason saw in her a genuine willingness to try. When can you start? Emily thought quickly. Tomorrow morning. Mason extended his hand. Welcome to the Masons family, Emily. The next morning, exactly at 11:30 a.m., Jack Thompson pushed through the diner door. He had spent 3 days avoiding the place, but the loneliness had become unbearable. Mason's wasn't just where he ate. It was the only place where he still felt part of something. He stopped when he saw an unfamiliar young woman organizing the tables with movements that were a bit hesitant, clearly still learning where everything went. When she raised her eyes and saw him standing in the entrance, her face lit up with a smile that seemed genuine, although he could detect the nervousness behind it. Good morning. Welcome to Mason's. Jack was momentarily disconcerted. There was a slight tremor in her voice that indicated nervousness, but also a determination to do the job well. He saved his voice and nodded, heading to his usual corner. Emily followed him, carrying a tray with some dirty glasses and a menu. Mason had given her information about regular customers, but she was still processing all the details. Coffee to start? She asked, placing the menu on the table. Coffee. Very hot, he said, watching her reaction. Knowing Marcus's story, Emily was attentive and said, Of course I'll make fresh coffee for you. Emily smiled. I'll be right back with it. As she walked away, Jack found himself analyzing. There was something different in the way she acted, not the overconfidence he would expect from someone experienced, but a careful attention that suggested she really cared about getting it right. When Emily returned with the coffee, Jack took a cautious sip. It was hot, maybe even a little too hot, but acceptable. Ready to order? She asked, pen in hand, discreetly consulting a small note. In the palm of her hand, meatloaf with mashed potatoes, no extra seasonings. Emily wrote carefully, then hesitated. Excuse me, but the potatoes with or without butter, I don't want to assume. Jack paused. The question came from her uncertainty, not from prior knowledge. In all the years coming to Mason's, no one had ever asked that, although he always removed the butter discreetly. Without butter, he said, his voice slightly softer. Great, Emily smiled, writing it down. Anything else? No, he said, watching her lips. Emily prepared to leave, but hesitated. Sir, if you need anything or if you're not satisfied with something, you can let me know, okay? I'm still learning, but I want to get it right. The simple honesty of her words caught him off guard. There was no pretension, just a young woman trying to do her job well. All right, he responded, and for the first time in days his voice sounded less harsh. The following days established a gradual routine. Jack arrived punctually at 11:30, sat at table 12, and Emily served his black coffee, followed by meatloaf with mashed potatoes without butter. She still made small occasional mistakes, sometimes took time to find something or hesitated about details, but there was a sincerity in her efforts that Jack began to notice. Emily, in turn, observed without knowing exactly what she was looking for. She noticed how Jack always arrived a few minutes early and observed the interior before entering, how he invariably chose the same seat with his back to the wall, how his eyes constantly scanned the environment, a vigilance that never completely relaxed. More intriguingly, she noticed how he reacted to sounds. When plates clattered in the kitchen, he tensed almost imperceptibly. When voices got too loud, his shoulders rose slightly. And when she spoke with him, he always leaned slightly forward, as if concentrating intensely on every word to understand what was being said. "Mr. Thompson," she said on a Thursday while serving his coffee, "do you think it's going to rain today?" He looked at her with surprise. It was the first time she had initiated a conversation that wasn't strictly about the order. "It's cold outside, but I don't think it's going to rain today," he responded laconically. "That's right," Emily agreed, organizing the sugar dispenser that Jack never used. "At least the coffee helps warm up, right?" It wasn't brilliant, but it was genuine. Jack nodded slightly. "Your meatloaf will be ready in a few minutes," she said. "Emily," Jack called her, surprising them both. "Yes?" "The coffee is good today." It wasn't much, but Emily smiled as if she had received the greatest compliment in the world. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson." Over the weeks, Jack began to notice small changes. Emily was becoming more confident, making fewer mistakes. But more than that, she interacted naturally with all the customers. He watched her talking with Mr. Peterson about his grandson, or remembering that Mrs. Williams liked extra sugar in her tea. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Jack began to respond with more than monosyllables when she asked casual questions. Not much, just brief comments about the weather, or a nod of approval when she got some detail of his order right without asking. On a particularly grey Thursday in December, the fine rain that had started in the morning showed no signs of stopping. Jack left Mason's after his usual lunch, pulling his military coat tighter against his chest as he walked down the wet street toward his house. Water dripped persistently from the roofs, creating small puddles that reflected the leaden sky, and the sound of drops hitting the asphalt created a melancholic symphony that seemed to echo the veteran's state of mind. He had walked 2 blocks when something different broke the monotony. A low whimper, almost swallowed by the noise of the rain, but persistent enough to penetrate his already compromised hearing. Jack stopped, tilting his right head slightly, the ear that still worked better. The sound came from a vacant lot, covered with tall weeds and scattered trash, an urban wound that the neighborhood preferred to ignore. For a moment, Jack considered continuing on his way. It wasn't his problem. He had learned, over 7 decades of life, that getting involved in other people's situations rarely ended well. But the whimpering continued, weak and desperate, each moan carrying a vulnerability that echoed something deep inside him, something he preferred to keep buried along with his war medals. Reluctantly, but at the same time curious, Jack approached the overgrown weeds. He stepped carefully between broken bottles and soaked papers that were dissolving in the humidity. The rain had turned the earth into dark mud that stuck to his shoes. At the back of the lot, partially hidden behind a pile of rubble and broken bricks, was a cardboard box already soaked, inadequately covered with a black garbage bag that the wind had partially torn off. When Jack completely removed the wet plastic, his stomach contracted in a physical contraction that caught him off guard. Inside the deteriorated box, a puppy of no more than 2 months looked at him with enormous eyes, opaque from dehydration and illness. The animal was so thin that Jack could count every rib through the tangled and soaked golden fur. Small wounds dotted his tiny body, and it was clear that parasites had found a home in his fragile skin. Even more disturbing, the puppy trembled uncontrollably, not just from cold, but from a weakness that Jack recognized, the weakness of someone who is too close to the line between life and death. The puppy tried to lift his head when he noticed the human presence, but the effort was clearly exhausting. His movements were slow, uncoordinated, and Jack could see that each breath was a small miracle. The rain continued falling, turning the box into a deadly trap of humidity and cold. For a moment, just a moment, something moved in Jack's chest. A pang of recognition, perhaps. The puppy reminded him of something distant, of young faces that had looked at him with the same desperate vulnerability, the same blind trust that he could make the difference between life and death. But Jack Thompson had learned, over 7 decades and a war that lasted too long, that some responsibilities were too heavy to carry. There were soldiers he couldn't save. There was a daughter who died in an accident he couldn't prevent. There was a wife who had a heart attack while he was buying medicine at the pharmacy. 5 more minutes and maybe she would still be alive. "Not my problem," he murmured, taking a few steps back. The puppy emitted a weak moan, more a sigh than an appeal, but Jack was already turning away. He put the plastic back over the box, an inadequate protection that he knew was useless against the rain that showed no signs of stopping. "I'm sorry," he said to the box, although he didn't know exactly why he was apologizing. The walk home was faster than usual. Jack kept his eyes fixed on the wet ground ahead of him, avoiding looking back. But with each step, the weak whimpering echoed in his ears, mixing with other sounds he preferred to forget. The last breath of wounded soldiers, the terrible silence that followed when someone stopped fighting. At home, Jack took off his soaked coat and hung it on the entrance coat rack. His house was small, organized with the military precision that had never left him, each object in its place, each surface clean, each room functioning as an extension of his internal discipline. He prepared hot chocolate to warm his body, sat in the same armchair where he watched the news every night, and tried to distract himself with something on TV. But his mind insisted on returning to the vacant lot. The puppy had probably already stopped whimpering, not because someone had found him, but because he no longer had the strength to make sound. The rain continued beating against his house windows, each drop a reminder that a few blocks away, a defenseless animal was slowly dying in a soaked cardboard box. "It's not my business," he said aloud to the silence of the room, as if pronouncing, the words could make them true. But in the silence that followed, other voices began to whisper. Voices he had spent decades trying to silence. Jessica's voice at 8 years old, asking why they couldn't adopt the kitten they had seen on the street. His wife, Margaret's voice, saying there were things worth risking, even when you could get hurt. Soldier Morrison's voice, who died in his arms, whispering, "Doctor, at least I tried. At least I didn't give up." Jack got up abruptly from the armchair, walking to the kitchen window. The rain had diminished to a persistent drizzle, but it was still enough to kill an already weakened animal. He looked at the clock. 40 minutes had passed since he left the puppy. 40 minutes that could mean the difference between life and death. "I can barely take care of myself," he said to his reflection in the window. "I'm 72 years old. What do I know about caring for a dog?" But even as he spoke, his hands were already searching for the car keys, because the truth that Jack had tried to bury along with all his dead, was that he knew a lot about caring. He had been a military doctor for 30 years, trained to assess injuries, administer medications, make quick decisions under pressure. He had cared for his wife during her illness, his daughter during her difficult childhood, hundreds of soldiers who trusted their lives to his hands, and there was an emergency veterinary clinic 10 minutes away by car. He passed it every time. He went to the bank, absent-mindedly noticing the neon sign that promised 24-hour service. "Damn," he whispered, taking the still damp coat plus a towel. The trip back to the vacant lot was made with his chest tight with guilt and urgency. Jack drove faster than recommended on the wet streets, his hands gripping the steering wheel, with unnecessary force. At each red light he imagined the puppy stopping breathing. At each block he wondered if he wasn't arriving too late. When he arrived at the lot, he got out of the car without even turning off the engine. His feet splashed in the mud as he ran to where he had left the box. The plastic he had replaced was partially torn off by the wind, and when Jack removed it completely, his heart almost stopped. The puppy was still breathing, but barely. His eyes were closed, his body completely motionless except for the almost imperceptible movement of his chest, rising and falling at irregular intervals. The box was flooded, and the animal was lying in the cold water as if he had already given up. "No, no, no," Jack murmured, wrapping the puppy in the towel like someone protecting a treasure. The animal was cold and limp, so light it seemed made of air. "Hold on, little one, hold on." He ran back to the car, holding the puppy against his chest, feeling the weak breathing against his shirt. He turned the heater to maximum, and drove to the veterinary clinic with an urgency he hadn't felt since his days saving lives in a war zone. The emergency veterinary clinic was a low, modern building with fluorescent lights that seemed to shine, like a lighthouse in the grey afternoon. Jack entered carrying the puppy wrapped in his shirt and was immediately greeted by a receptionist in her 20s wearing colourful scrubs. "I need help," he said, and his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to emergency situations. "I found this puppy. He's very sick." The receptionist looked at the animal in Jack's hands and immediately called a veterinary technician. Jack watched as trained professionals examined the puppy with the same efficiency he himself used to have when evaluating wounded soldiers. There were hushed conversations, quick movements, an attempt to place a tiny IV. "Dr. Harrison will examine him now," said the receptionist, turning to Jack. "We'll need some information. Are you the owner?" Jack hesitated. For a moment he considered saying no, that he had just found the animal and wanted to make sure it received care. It would be simpler, less commitment, less chance of getting hurt when, not if, but when things went wrong. But he looked at the puppy, now under bright lights on an examination table, and saw all the soldiers he had treated, all those he had lost, all the times he had had to make decisions in seconds that would determine whether someone would live or die. And for the first time in years, he chose to fight instead of retreat. "Yes," he said, his voice coming out firmer than expected. "I am." "Animal's name?" Jack looked again at the puppy. For some reason, a word came to mind, a word that carried memories of youth, of hope, of a time when he believed he could save everyone who needed to be saved. "Scout," he said. "His name is Scout." And in that moment, pronouncing that name, in a veterinary clinic with clothes still damp from rain and mud on his boots, Jack Thompson made a decision that would change not only the animal's life, but his own. For the first time in many years, he had chosen to fight for a life instead of protecting himself from the possibility of losing it. Dr. Harrison, a middle-aged man with graying hair and gentle hands, came out of the examination room after what seemed like an eternity. "Mr. Thompson, Jack Thompson. Mr. Thompson, Scout is in critical but stable condition for now. Severe dehydration, malnutrition, parasitic infection, and what appears to be early pneumonia. A few more hours in that rain." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Jack nodded, intimately knowing the fragility of life when pushed beyond its limits. "What do we need to do?" "He'll need to be hospitalized for at least 3 days for IV and antibiotics." Jack frowned, straining to hear, "Did you say 3 days of hospitalization?" "Yes, that's right," confirmed the doctor and continued. "After that, it will be a long recovery process at home. Daily medications, specialized feeding, constant monitoring. I won't lie, it will be expensive and laborious." Jack thought about his empty house, his silent nights, the mornings when he woke up without clear purpose. He thought about Jessica, who always said he should adopt some animal to fill the silence that his mother had left. He thought about the soldiers he couldn't save, and the opportunity to perhaps save this small life that had literally fallen into his path. "Do everything necessary," he said. "I'll take care of him." In the following 3 weeks, Jack's routine changed completely. Now his day began at 5 a.m. with Scout's medication administration, expensive antibiotics that consumed a considerable slice of his military retirement, vitamins to strengthen a devastated immune system, and a special food that cost 3 times more than regular food. But Jack didn't mind. For the first time in years, he had something worth spending money on. Scout had survived the first critical days, but just barely. Jack slept on the living room sofa to stay close to the puppy's improvised basket, checking his breathing during the early morning hours like an obsessive father with his first baby. Sometimes he woke up in panic, fearing that Scout had stopped breathing, only to find that the animal was sleeping deeply for the first time in weeks. Slowly, with the tenacity that only young animals possess, Scout began to recover. First were the eyes, losing that opacity of illness and gaining a golden shine that made Jack smile without realizing it. Then came strength in the legs, allowing Scout to stand for a few seconds before collapsing, exhausted but determined. It was while caring for Scout that Jack rediscovered fragments of himself that he thought he had buried along with his past. Memories from more than 60 years ago returned in nostalgic waves. His first dog, Ranger, a smart mutt he had found at the door of his house when he was only 8 years old. He remembered teaching Ranger to fetch sticks in the Ohio backyard, sleeping with the too big animal curled up at the foot of the bed, the incomparable feeling of having something that depended completely on him and loved him without questioning, without judging, without expecting anything but care and presence. Ranger had died of old age while Jack was in Vietnam, and the news came in a letter from his mother that he read in a muddy trench, crying silently, while explosions echoed in the distance. He had sworn never again to get attached to something he could lose, but Scout, with his absolute vulnerability and blind trust, was making Jack question whether some pains were worth risking. When Scout finally managed to walk to the kitchen door without stumbling, Jack knew it was time to start. Walks. They started slowly, just to the corner and back, but gradually increased the distance. Scout was a natural explorer, stopping to smell every tree, every post, every flower bed, as if cataloguing an entirely new world. And for Jack, who had walked the same streets for years without really seeing them, it was like rediscovering his own neighborhood through the curious eyes of the puppy. As Scout recovered and Jack adapted to the new care routine, something unexpected happened. He began to avoid Mason's diner. At first, it was just a few days missed here and there, when Scout needed to go to the veterinarian, or when medications made him sleepy and Jack preferred to stay home watching the animal. But gradually, these absences became more frequent. Jack discovered he could call other restaurants and have his meal delivered to his house. It was more convenient, less stressful, and meant he didn't have to leave Scout alone during the first critical months of recovery. What began as a practical solution became a preference. At home, Jack felt more relaxed. He didn't need to strain to hear conversations in a noisy environment. There were no curious looks when he asked for something to be repeated, and Scout was always by his side, a silent and comforting presence. In the following days, Emily began to notice something strange. Table 12 remained empty during lunchtime. "Jenny," she asked on a Wednesday while organizing the condiments, "it's been a while since Mr. Thompson came to lunch." "True," Carlos added, emerging from the kitchen with a tray of clean dishes. "Now that you mention it, I think it's been more than 2 weeks since I've seen him here. Maybe he finally found a place that tolerates his attitude," Jenny commented, but there was less malice in her voice than usual. Emily frowned. There was something that bothered her about Jack's absence, although she couldn't identify exactly what. In the short time she had worked at Mason's, Jack had been a constant, difficult, demanding, but predictable. His presence was part of the restaurant's rhythm. "Mr. Mason," Emily called when the owner passed by the counter. "Is Mr. Thompson okay? It's been a while since he came." Mason paused, thoughtful. "Now that you mention it, he's called a few times ordering delivery. Said he can't leave the house. I didn't want to be invasive, so I didn't ask why." "Delivery? Wow. But is he okay?" Emily asked, surprised. "By his voice, I believe so," Mason confirmed. Emily felt a pang of curiosity and genuine concern. In the short time she had worked at Mason's, Jack had been a constant, difficult, demanding, but predictable, and now, suddenly, he had simply disappeared. During the weeks that followed, Jack's absence became a mystery in the restaurant. Occasionally, Mason mentioned he had received a call from him ordering delivery, but the orders were sporadic. Sometimes days passed without orders. "Strange," Jenny commented one morning. "A man who ate the same thing every day suddenly disappears from the world." It was when Scout turned 4 months old that the first piece of the puzzle fell into place. Emily was cleaning the front windows one April morning when she noticed a familiar figure walking slowly on the sidewalk across the street. For a moment, she thought she was seeing things. Jack Thompson, the grumpy man from Table 12, was walking slowly, accompanied by a medium-sized golden dog that trotted beside him with controlled energy. "Guys, you're not going to believe this," Emily called, making Jenny and Carlos approach the window. "That's not possible," Jenny murmured, watching Jack stop while letting Scout sniff a fire hydrant. "Mr. Grumpy has a dog." And look how he is. Different, Carlos added, genuinely surprised. Calmer. Emily observed the scene with fascination. There was something deeply tender about the way Jack held the leash, firm enough for safety, but loose enough to give the animal freedom. When Scout stopped to investigate a flower bed, Jack waited patiently, even smiling slightly when the dog lifted his leg on a tree. He seems at peace, Emily said, more to herself. Different how? Asked Jenny, still processing the sight of the man who had made Marcus quit, now gently petting a dog's head. More relaxed. Like he found something he needed. In the following days, the morning observation became an unofficial routine. Emily, Jenny, and Carlos took turns being near the window at 8 in the morning, watching Jack and Scout pass by. It was like watching a transformation in slow motion. Seriously, can someone explain this to me? Jenny said on a Wednesday, seeing Jack teach Scout to sit on the sidewalk. How can a man who yells at waiters about lukewarm coffee be so patient with a dog? Maybe he always had that in him, Emily suggested, and just needed something to care for. Or maybe he's going senile, Jenny laughed, but there was a subtle cruelty in the observation. At his age, does he even know what he's doing? Emily frowned. He doesn't seem confused, he seems purposeful. Emily always defending lost causes, Carlos joked, but without malice. You have to admit, it's strange. The man can barely have a civilized conversation. How is he going to train an animal? And when the dog grows up, Jenny added, Jack must be over 70 years old. Statistically, he'll die before the animal. Who's going to take care of it then? Jesus, Jenny, Emily said, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. I'm being realistic, Jenny defended herself. It's irresponsible for a man his age to get a puppy. And then, when he gets sick or dies, where will the animal end? Up? In the shelter? Carlos shook his head. It's true. Besides, if he can't communicate properly with people, imagine training a dog. I bet in 2 months the animal will be destroying his house and he'll be yelling at the poor thing. Emily felt a pang of irritation. You're being too harsh. Look at him. The dog is well trained, doesn't pull on the leash, obeys. For now, Jenny murmured. Wait until he becomes a teenager. But week after week, as they watched Jack and Scout pass by, something curious began to happen. The malicious comments gradually gave way to genuine perplexity. Is he smiling? Jenny asked one morning, watching Jack react to Scout trying to chase a butterfly. And the dog is perfectly behaved, Carlos admitted reluctantly. Look, he stops. When Jack stops, doesn't bark at other dogs. Maybe Jack knows what he's doing, Emily said softly. Or maybe, Carlos said thoughtfully, we never really knew him. We only saw the bad-tempered side. Emily nodded. There was something in the way Jack interacted with Scout that revealed a gentleness she had always suspected was hidden under all that rudeness. It was as if the dog had unlocked a part of him that had been sleeping for years. As Scout grew, the morning walks became longer and more elaborate. The dog, now 6 months old, had transformed into a perfectly trained companion. He didn't chew household objects, didn't make messes, obeyed simple commands with the precision that only constant patience can teach. Jack, in turn, seemed to have found a renewed purpose. It was on an April afternoon, when Scout was exactly 6 months old and already demonstrated the independence and self-control of a well-educated dog, that Jack's life changed again. This time, dramatically and unexpectedly. Jack had spent the quiet morning at home with Scout. In the middle of the afternoon, he decided to prepare a simple vegetable soup for dinner, a recipe that Margaret used to make and that always made him remember happier days. He chopped onions, carrots, and celery with the precision he had learned during years of cooking for himself, added chicken broth and seasonings, and put everything in a large pot on the stove. The soup would need to cook slowly for about an hour, so Jack lowered the heat and went to the living room to watch television. Scout, confident that he could be alone without causing problems, curled up in his favorite bed near the window. At 6 months, he had completely overcome the destructive phase of canine youth and had become a silent and well-behaved companion. The television program was one of those old reruns that Jack had seen dozens of times, a war movie from the 1960s that normally made him reflect on his own days of service. But that afternoon, between the warmth of the sun coming through the window and Scout's calming presence, Jack felt more relaxed than he had felt in months. Without realizing it, his eyes began to grow heavy. The peaceful environment, the aroma of soup cooking in the kitchen, the low murmur of the television, everything conspired to create an atmosphere of peace that Jack rarely experienced. Within minutes, he had fallen deeply asleep on the sofa. What Jack didn't know was that the stove flame, adjusted for slow cooking, wasn't working properly. A small problem in the regulator made the flame higher than selected, and gradually, without supervision, the soup began to boil vigorously. In 40 minutes, all the water had evaporated. In 50 minutes, the vegetables began to stick to the bottom of the pot. In 1 hour, the pot was dry and the food remains began to burn, creating thick, acrid smoke that quickly spread through the kitchen. The house's smoke detector went off with a loud, shrill sound, exactly as it was designed to do. But Jack didn't hear it. His hearing loss combined with deep sleep made him not notice the alarm. The old detector emitted high-pitched sounds that Jack could no longer hear clearly. He continued sleeping on the sofa, unconscious of the danger developing just a few meters away. Scout, however, immediately noticed something was wrong. The acrid smell of burning food hit his sensitive nostrils, and the loud sound of the alarm made him jump from his bed with a start. For a moment, Scout was confused, looking between sleeping Jack and the direction where the smell and noise were coming from. His canine instincts, honed by evolution to detect danger, went into maximum alert. Scout began to bark, not the casual play bark that Jack had learned to recognize, but an urgent, insistent, desperate bark. He ran to the sofa, putting his paws on Jack's chest, licking his face, trying anything to wake him up. When Jack continued sleeping, Scout became more aggressive in his efforts. He lightly bit Jack's shirt sleeve, pulled with his teeth, even tried to push the man with his determined body. It was Scout's persistent movement, more than any sound, that finally penetrated Jack's deep sleep. He woke up confused, disoriented, immediately feeling that something was very wrong. The smell of smoke hit his nostrils almost at the same moment he opened his eyes. "My God," Jack murmured, jumping from the sofa with an agility he hadn't displayed in years. The kitchen was filled with thick smoke, and through the haze, Jack could see small but real flames licking the edges of the pot on the stove. Without hesitating, he ran to the cabinet under the sink, where he kept a fire extinguisher, a habit from his military days that had never left him. With efficient, trained movements, Jack aimed the extinguisher at the base of the flames and fired a burst of chemical foam. The fire was controlled in seconds, but the damage was done. The pot was ruined, the stove was covered with chemical residue and soot, and the entire kitchen would need extensive cleaning and repairs before it could be used again. More importantly, Jack realized with a shiver of real fear that if it weren't for Scout, he could have woken up in a house on fire, or not woken up at all. He knelt on the kitchen floor, ignoring the smoke still in the air, and pulled Scout into a tight hug. The animal, still agitated but clearly relieved, licked Jack's face with renewed enthusiasm. "You saved me," Jack whispered into the golden fur. "You really saved me." In the days that followed, while Jack dealt with the cleanup and organized the necessary repairs in the kitchen, practical reality imposed itself. He would need to eat out until everything was working again. With Scout now demonstrating that he could stay home alone without problems, Jack made a decision he hadn't made in months. The morning after the accident, for the first time in almost 4 months, Jack Thompson walked alone to Mason's diner. The doorbell rang with the same familiar sound as always, but this time all heads turned. Emily was organizing tables when she looked up and almost dropped the tray she was carrying. "Mr. Thompson," she exclaimed, a genuine smile lighting up her face. "Wow, it's been so long. What brings you here?" Jack waved briefly, heading to his usual table, number 12. To his surprise, he felt slightly nervous, as if it were the first time he had entered the place. Emily followed him, still processing the unexpected return. "Want the usual? Meatloaf with mashed potatoes without butter?" Jack hesitated, looking around the restaurant as if seeing it with new eyes. "Actually, let me see the menu, please." Emily blinked, surprised. In all the months she had worked there, Jack had never looked at the menu. She quickly brought one. watching with curiosity as he leafed through it slowly. After a few minutes of consideration, Jack closed the menu and looked at her with something that almost seemed like an embarrassed smile. Meatloaf with mashed potatoes without butter. Emily laughed softly. All right, sometimes it's good to confirm we still like the same things. Coffee too? Please. When the food arrived, still steaming from the kitchen, Jack took the first bite and made an expression of genuine satisfaction. Is it good? Emily asked, passing by to collect some plates from other tables. Much better than I expected, Jack admitted. Hot food, freshly prepared. Every minute counts, really. Emily smiled, hearing the familiar expression. It's different from delivery, right? Hot food is always better. It really is, Jack agreed and then hesitated. Actually, that's why I'm here. My kitchen, I had a small accident. Emily stopped, her attention completely focused on him. Accident? Is everything okay? Nothing serious, Jack said quickly. I forgot a pot on the stove, ended up falling asleep, burned everything, made smoke. It'll take a few days to fix. Emily frowned. But don't you have a smoke detector? Didn't the alarm go off? What? Jack asked. The alarm, Emily repeated, this time paying attention to how Jack strained to hear her. Didn't the smoke detector go off? Oh, it did, Jack confirmed. But I didn't hear it. It was Scout who woke me up, barking and pushing me. Luckily, Scout woke me up. If it weren't for him... Wow, Emily said. How dangerous. Thank goodness you weren't alone. Emily felt something click in her mind. The times Jack asked for repetition, the way he always watched her intensely when she spoke, as if lip-reading. Mr. Thompson, she said gently, can I ask a question? I don't want to be invasive, but do you have difficulty hearing? Jack tensed for a moment, then sighed. Maybe. A little. Is that why you didn't hear the alarm? The detector at home is old, Jack explained reluctantly. Combined with heavy sleep, it happens. Emily chose her words carefully. Jack, I don't want to seem intrusive, but I think you need to see a doctor. Get hearing tests. It's not that serious. But it's about safety, Emily interrupted gently. Your safety, and Scout's too. That last phrase hit Jack like a punch to the stomach. The idea that his negligence could put Scout in danger, Scout, who had just recovered from the terrible state he found him in, Scout, who had literally saved his life, was unbearable. He looked at Emily, seeing the genuine concern in her eyes, and for the first time in years allowed someone to care enough to confront him with a difficult truth. You're right, he said finally. I think I need to prioritize that. Emily nodded. For you and for Scout. You two take care of each other. Jack remained silent for a moment, processing her words. Scout had saved his life, but if something happened again and he couldn't react in time, the image of the 2-month-old puppy, wet and almost dead in that cardboard box, returned with full force. I don't want him to go through anything bad. Again, Jack murmured, more to himself than to Emily. Sorry, Jack, I don't want to interrupt your lunch, but think about the hearing exam, Emily said, noticing that the food had cooled during the conversation. Jack nodded slowly, cutting a piece of the meatloaf that was no longer hot. Emily's words echoed in his mind for the rest of the meal. For the first time in years, someone had cared enough to confront him with a truth he had been avoiding. 3 months passed before Jack finally called the VA hospital. He had postponed the decision repeatedly, always finding a new justification. Scout needed follow-up consultations. The kitchen renovation took longer than expected. He didn't want to admit he really needed help. But mainly, there was fear. Fear of confirming what he already knew. Fear of facing another limitation that age and war had imposed on him. But on the morning of a grey Thursday in July, with Scout sleeping peacefully in the porch sun and the silence of the house seeming heavier than usual, Jack couldn't postpone anymore. Hampton VA Medical Center, how can I help you? I'd like to schedule an appointment with an otolaryngologist, Jack said, his voice sounding too formal to his own ear. Of course, sir. Is this your first time? Yes. 3 weeks later, Jack was sitting in a silent booth in the hospital's audiology department, wearing headphones, while an audiometrist conducted a series of tests through a glass window. The hospital environment was familiar, smell of disinfectant, fluorescent lights, the constant murmur of medical activity in the corridor. After decades as a military doctor, Jack felt more comfortable in hospitals than in most other places. "Now, I'm going to play some tones," said Dr. Sandra Williams, her voice clear through the intercom. "Raise your right hand when you hear something in your right ear, left when you hear in your left." Jack went through the tests methodically, raising his hand when he could detect sounds, remaining still when he couldn't. It was a process that required concentration, and he found himself applying the same discipline he used during complex medical procedures decades ago. After 40 minutes of tests, Dr. Williams removed the headphones and began filling out some forms. "Well, Mr. Thompson, the results show moderate to severe hearing loss, mainly in high frequencies. It's consistent with prolonged exposure to loud noises, explosions, military equipment. I see here that you served in Vietnam." 30 years. "Of service," Jack confirmed. "Field medic." "That explains the pattern we're seeing. The good news is that modern hearing aids can help significantly with this type of loss." She paused, consulting the file. "I'll need some basic information for the file. Do you have any close family, Mr. Thompson?" Jack hesitated for a moment, fidgeting with his hands. "I have a son, Major David Thompson. He's also in the armed forces." "Would you like to include him as an emergency contact?" The silence extended long enough for Dr. Williams to look up from the form, noticing the conflicted expression on Jack's face. "No," Jack said finally, his voice lower. "We don't talk much since my wife died. She was always the one who kept the family together." The audiometrist nodded with professional understanding without pressing the subject. "No problem. You can leave it blank for now." She continued filling out the paperwork, explaining about different types of hearing aids, costs covered by military insurance, and the adjustment process that would take several weeks. Jack listened attentively, asking occasional technical questions, but part of his mind was distant, thinking about David. "The complete process will take about 4 months, Dr. Williams explained. "We need to make molds of your ear. Then the device is manufactured according to your specifications. Then there's the adjustment period. Your brain needs to relearn to process sounds you haven't heard in years." 4 months, Jack repeated, calculating mentally. That would take him until November. Yes, but it's worth the wait. Many of our patients are surprised by how much they had lost. She smiled. Some rediscover simple pleasures, music, conversations, in noisy environments, even sounds they didn't realize they missed. Jack nodded, thinking about Scout barking to wake him during the fire, about sounds he might be missing every day. And thinking for the first time in a long time, if David had tried to call him at some point and he simply hadn't heard the phone ring. "Let's start," he said, his voice carrying a determination he hadn't felt in months. The sooner, the better. Early November arrived with Virginia Beach's characteristic cold, and Jack Thompson sat at his usual table at Mason's Diner with a sense of satisfaction he hadn't experienced in years. His hearing aid had been adjusted for the last time the previous week, and for the first time in decades he could hear with crystalline clarity that surprised him every day. He could hear the murmur of conversations at distant tables, the precise sound of plates being placed on tables, even the almost imperceptible hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. It was as if the world had gained a new sound dimension that he had forgotten existed. "Your meatloaf is coming, Mr. Thompson," Emily said, approaching with a tray. "And I can say that you now hear everything and everyone. We can't even gossip about other customers anymore," she joked, with a mischievous smile. Jack surprised himself by smiling back. "I discovered you make much more interesting comments than I imagined." "Oh, how embarrassing," Emily laughed, placing the plate in front of him. "I hope you didn't hear anything too compromising." "Nothing I didn't already know about human nature," Jack replied, and there was a lightness in his voice that Emily had rarely heard before. She stayed for a moment, organizing the salt and pepper, unnecessarily, as if gathering courage for something. "Jack," she said finally, "can I ask a question? Do you have family here in Virginia? Thanksgiving is coming." The change in Jack's expression was instantaneous. The smile disappeared, and he lowered his head slightly, fidgeting with his fork without really cutting the food. "I have a son," he said after a pause. "David, He's also military, but he's stationed at Fort Hood in Texas. Emily waited, sensing there was more to the story. But besides the distance, Jack hesitated, choosing his words carefully. We haven't spoken since his mother passed away. It's been over 5 years. Emily's face contracted with genuine sadness. Oh, Jack, sorry. If I had known, I wouldn't have brought up this subject. It's okay, Jack said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. I learned to face the reality of things very early in life. Life is hard, Emily. Sometimes we lose the people we love, and sometimes we lose the ability to connect with those who are still here. Emily felt the weight of that confession in the air between them. There was a resigned acceptance in Jack's voice that made her want to do something, anything to alleviate that loneliness she could see so clearly now. You know, she said softly, my family always has a big lunch on Thanksgiving. Nothing very sophisticated, just home cooking and lots of conversation. If you want, and if you don't have other plans, would you like to join us? Jack looked, clearly surprised by the offer. You can bring Scout too, Emily continued quickly, seeing the hesitation on his face. He's well behaved, and at home he can play with my dog, Max. They'll get along well, I'm sure, and she smiled gently. It would be an honor to have you both with us. Jack remained silent for a long moment, processing the unexpected generosity of the offer. It had been so long since anyone had invited him to be part of something that he had almost forgotten what it was like to be included in a family tradition. I wouldn't want to bother. It wouldn't be a bother, Emily interrupted, gently. It would be a joy. How about it, next Thursday noon? Jack looked at her. This young woman who had been patient with his rudeness, who had worried about his hearing, who now offered her family table to a lonely old man and his dog, and felt something move in his chest that he had long forgotten existed. I would love to, he said finally, and his voice carried a gratitude that went far beyond words. Scout and I, we would love to. Thanksgiving morning arrived golden and fresh, with the kind of autumn light that made Virginia Beach look like a painting. Jack carefully adjusted his newest dress shirt, a recent purchase he had made thinking of the occasion, and looked at Scout, who seemed to sense the expectation in the air and wagged his tail with contained energy. We're going to meet new people today, partner, Jack said, petting the golden head. Scout tilted his head, and Jack smiled, realizing he could hear perfectly the small whimper of curiosity the animal emitted. The Carter house was a 2-story residence in a quiet neighborhood, with a wraparound porch decorated with pumpkins and autumn leaves. When Jack rang the doorbell, nervously holding Scout's leash, he was greeted by an explosion of sounds that his new hearing aid captured with a clarity that surprised him. Voices laughing in the kitchen, soft music playing in the background, the sound of pots and dishes being moved, even the distant noise of a television somewhere in the house. Jack, Scout, you came. Emily opened the door with a radiant smile, wearing an apron printed with cartoon turkeys. Come in, Mom, they're here. Mrs. Carter appeared from the kitchen, drying her hands on a dish towel, and Jack immediately recognized where Emily had inherited her natural kindness. Jack! Emily has talked so much about you, and this must be the famous Scout. Scout, who had been slightly tense with the new smells and sounds, immediately relaxed when Mrs. Carter bent down to greet him. The animal approached cautiously, sniffing her extended hand, and soon was accepting pets behind his ears. He's a sweetheart, Mrs. Carter declared. Max is in the backyard. Emily, how about introducing them? The Carter backyard was spacious and well-maintained, with old trees that filtered sunlight into golden patterns on the lawn. Max, an older chocolate Labrador, rose from his favorite position under an oak tree and approached with the dignity of an experienced dog receiving visitors. Jack watched fascinated as Scout and Max went through the canine rituals of introduction, sniffing, evaluating, establishing a friendly hierarchy. Within minutes, the two were exploring the yard together, Scout following Max's lead with the appropriate deference of a well-educated visitor. They got along well, Mr. Carter observed, appearing beside Jack with 2 cold beers. Look how they're playing. They have a lot of energy. During lunch, Jack found himself experiencing something he hadn't felt in years, the simple pleasure of being immersed in family conversation. With his hearing aid working perfectly, he could follow multiple conversations simultaneously. Emily and her sister Rachel discussing weekend plans, Mrs. Carter explaining the cranberry sauce recipe, Mr. Carter making gentle jokes about the local football team. Even more wonderful, he could hear the layers of sound that formed the soundtrack of a happy family. The clink of silverware against plates, genuine laughter, even the distant sound of music and voices coming from other houses in the neighborhood, families celebrating their own Thanksgiving traditions. "Jack," Mrs. Carter said during dessert, "Emily told us that Scout was abandoned and you adopted him. How did your life change after that?" Jack paused with his fork in the air, considering the question. "Scout changed my life in ways I never imagined were possible," he said finally. "He taught me that I was still capable of caring." "And you saved his life," Emily added softly. "Actually," Jack corrected, looking out the window where Scout and Max were sleeping side by side under a tree's shade, "I think it was the other way around." When it was time to leave, Jack found himself reluctant to break the day's spell. The Carters insisted on packing leftovers, generous slices of turkey, mashed potatoes, pumpkin pie, and Mrs. Carter hugged both Jack and Scout with the same warm affection. "Thank you," Jack said at the door, and the word carried all the weight of gratitude he felt, "for including me, for including us." "You'll always be welcome here," Mr. Carter replied, and Jack could see he really meant it. The drive home was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Scout was tired but content in the passenger seat, occasionally lifting his head to look out the window. Jack drove slowly, savoring the feeling of having spent an entire day surrounded by genuine, human warmth. But as he approached his own house, a strange feeling began to form in his chest. It wasn't sadness exactly, nor loneliness. He still felt enveloped by the day's joy. It was something different, an emptiness, as if something important was missing. He parked in the garage and sat for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel, trying to identify what he was feeling. Scout looked at him questioningly, noticing the hesitation. "What do you think, Scout?" Jack murmured. "Why do I feel like I forgot something important?" And then, as he turned off the engine in the silence of his garage, the answer came with a clarity that surprised him. David. His son was at Fort Hood, probably spending Thanksgiving alone on a military base, or maybe with colleagues who had become family of circumstance. And here was Jack, having just experienced what a true family could offer, while his own son remained a world away. Inside the house, Jack wandered aimlessly through the familiar rooms, Scout following him with growing curiosity. The house seemed especially empty after the vitality of the Carter house. He unnecessarily organized some books, adjusted pillows that were already in place, opened the refrigerator, and looked without seeing the contents. "I wonder if I call. Will he answer?" he said aloud, surprising himself with the sound of his own voice in the silent house. Scout tilted his head, as if actually considering the question. Jack remembered the last time he had tried to contact his son. It was on David's birthday. He had called 3 times throughout the day, leaving voicemails. That tried to sound casual, but came out too formal, too distant. David hadn't returned any of the calls. "Last time I called and he ignored me," Jack said to Scout, who had positioned himself near his empty water bowl. Maybe he was busy. Maybe he simply didn't know what to say. Jack filled Scout's bowl, the sound of water hitting metal echoing in the silent kitchen. He opened the refrigerator again, looked at the leftovers carefully packed by Mrs. Carter, and closed the door without taking anything. His steps led him to the living room, where the phone rested on its side table, silent and imposing like an unaccepted challenge. Jack sat in the armchair beside it, looking at the device as if it were a bomb that could explode. 5 years, he said to the phone. 5 years since we had a real conversation. Scout approached and rested his head on Jack's knee, offering the same silent and comforting presence he had offered since that first terrible night of the fire. Jack petted the golden fur, gathering courage. He had spent the entire day surrounded by a family that had accepted him with open arms, that had shown that connection and forgiveness were possible. Emily had risked by inviting him. The Carters had risked by receiving him. Maybe it was his turn to risk too. With deliberate movements, Jack picked up the phone and dialed a number he still knew by heart. His father's heart wouldn't allow him to forget that number. His fingers trembled slightly as he pressed the last digits. The phone rang once, Twice. 3 times. Hello? The voice was deeper than Jack remembered, but unmistakably familiar. For a moment, words failed completely. "Hi, son," Jack said finally, his voice coming out hoarser than intended. "It's Dad. It's been a while, I know. But today, for some reason, I felt I needed to tell you something. I love you." There was a pause on the other side of the line. Not the silence of rejection, but the quietness of surprise, of someone recalibrating expectations, of a son who had waited for this call more than he wanted to admit. At this moment, Jack smiled. Inside, discovering that his son didn't ignore him this time brought him a hint of hope. Sometimes the smallest gesture, a kind word, a second chance offered with an open heart, can echo farther than we imagine. Jack's story reminds us that kindness doesn't require perfection, just presence, just the courage to try again, even when fear whispers that it might be too late. And maybe in the end, that's what matters most. Not what we lost along the way, but what we can still build with the time we have left. One call, one word, one gesture at a time. And you? Have you ever been through a situation like Jack's? Did you have the courage to make that difficult call or reach out to someone after years of silence? Tell your story in the comments. Sometimes sharing our experience can inspire someone else to take the first step. If this story touched your heart, leave a like so more people can find it. And if you know someone who needs to hear about second chances, share this video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that warm the heart. Until next time.